just checking in. Looking at my attendees list, I know we have about a third of people on the call right now. So we're going to start in about 5 minutes time. So if you just want to hang on for a few more minutes, we'll get going at about 5 minutes past the hour. Give the stragglers a few minutes to get on board, and if they join us late, then they will catch us partway through our training. So we'll start again in about 5 minutes time. For those just signing on, welcome, good morning. We are going to wait about 2 more minutes. We're just having some stragglers coming on to the call, so we're going to wait for about 5 minutes past the hour, and then we will we'll get started with our motivational interviewing webinar this morning. Just because of the sheer volume of people on the call, we're going to have your microphones muted. If you have questions, please type them in the question chat box, and I'll be happy to respond to them as they do pop up. But simply want to make sure we're not going to be overwhelmed by the number of people talking all at once. All right, well, my clock says 5 minutes past the hour, so good morning, welcome everybody. We're about half of our attendees, which I suppose for Friday in July isn't too bad. Again, I'm Jeff with Code Consulting. I'll be your trainer facilitator for today, so we're going to go through some motivational interviewing in a housing program context. Just so I want to make sure we're clear on this, I've done motivational interviewing training as an attendee before, and it's usually a 2 full-day course for each level of motivational interviewing. So this is a 2-hour snapshot of motivational interviewing. So unfortunately, we can't have a full 2 days of training via webinar right now for you guys, and you have clients you need to be working with. But this will give you kind of the highlights, the skill set you need to do some motivational interviewing with your clients, having that intentional change conversation with everybody. If you've just joined us again, if you have questions throughout the training, please type them in the chat box. We're going to keep you guys muted, just as there would be chaos with all the open microphones. Otherwise, I've done trainings with multiple people, and it just gets a lot of feedback and noise in the background. So if you do have questions, just please type them in the chat box. If you've not used the webinar program before, it is on kind of like the bottom of your GoToWebinar chat pop-up box there. You can just type questions in, and I'll respond as they do appear. All right, so motivational interviewing. What exactly is motivational interviewing? It's a good question to begin with today. At its heart, motivational interviewing is really a conversation you're going to have with clients or with people in your life about change. It's a change conversation. So you have conversations around the weather, around what's for dinner, conversations around work tasks, but at its heart, motivational interviewing is really having a very on-purpose conversation with people about making a change in their life that they see as of being of value to them. At its very heart, it's person-centered. So it's not trying to impose your ideas, your values, your beliefs on somebody else. It's really truly about evoking and drawing forth for them the ideas for change, the rationale for change, and the opportunities to make a change in their life. So respecting that they are the decision maker and not having our ideas imposed on them, but rather having them share their ideas and their values with us, and then helping guide through the process of making that change a part of their life. The cool thing for me about motivational interviewing is it's really exploratory in its nature. It's really about asking a lot of questions, trying to draw forth values and commitments and beliefs, and sometimes also on purpose trying to create some conflict. Now, when I say creating conflict, I'm not trying to pick a fight with somebody. It's more of creating conflict around the idea of you're saying you want to do this new behavior, but your current behaviors are in conflict with that. So see the discrepancy and let's move past the discrepancy. And we'll get some examples throughout the training here about what motivational interviewing can be used for. But I'll just start off with one to kind of get us in the right headspace around what motivational interviewing is really all about. So if you're working with a client in the outreach stage, they're currently not housed, you've been engaging with them for a period of time, and they're saying to you they really want to find housing, but every time you set up a meeting with them to talk about housing options or go on viewings with your clients, they don't show up for them. So the conflict there is they're saying one thing of that they want housing, and yet the conflict is whenever you try to approach them about housing options, they're bailing on you. So the conflict arises from the stated purpose of I want to find some housing, and the actual behavior observing of they're not really following along with you guys there. So you do on purpose with motivational interviewing try to highlight those discrepancies and those conflicts and then work through them through the change process. Additionally, with motivational interviewing, we're talking about an evocative conversation. It's also important to note that people are more likely to change when the impetus for change, when the values you're pulling forth are their own as opposed to yours imposed upon them. So you're really trying to strengthen and draw forth their own commitment and their own motivation to making the change, as opposed to you telling them why it's a good idea, or you should do this at this point in time, or don't you know you should do this. So it's really not having that directive approach. It's more of the idea of trying to help them understand from their perspective why the change would be important to them. So that's, I think, kind of the heart of motivational interviewing. Before I flip over, I just want to make sure my pacing is okay for you guys before I go any further, because I've got a lot of slides today. I just want to make sure that I'm not going too fast through the content. We're okay with my pacing thus far. Can somebody just type in yes or no, and I will adjust as required. Thank you very much. All right. A few other key points about motivational interviewing, just to touch on before we talk about some of the how-tos of it. It's really about being collaborative in our approach. So we're working with our clients or with other people in our lives about that change, not working or doing things to them, but really having them part of that conversation. It's really focused on that goal planning, the goal orientation style, and with that, what we can really do, and we can't make people change, the idea you can lead a horse water, but you can't make them drink, as a kind of a little parallel for you there, is really having them strengthen their own commitment to making the change and setting and seeing what the goals are for themselves. So the idea is to help them identify the goal that they would like to work towards, and then drawing from their values and their motivation of why it's important to them to work on that particular set of goals or that particular change behavior. Instead of us imposing upon them why we think it's a good idea, it's really having them telling us, almost convincing us then, as we're helping them through the process of why that's a good idea for them to make that change. We'll talk about ambivalence as well. That comes up a little bit later in the slideshow, about the idea of, yes, I'd like to change, but change is hard. How do I get past that sitting on the fence mentality here? And so it recognizes with motivation interviewing that ambivalence does occur. Doesn't ignore it. It simply says we're going to work with ambivalence and try to work past that. And we'll talk about the language of change. I'm going to throw a couple terms at you shortly here of what we call change talk and don't change talk, and those are very much grounded in the language of motivation interviewing is the idea of change talk and don't change talk. So we're really going to focus on, when we're talking to people, how we're hearing things and what those things actually mean for our purposes. Now, also important to note what motivation interviewing is not. It's not the idea of ordering or directing or commanding somebody. It's not about, again, imposing our will on somebody. If you've ever parented a small child, I've got 2 kids, so I've made the mistake myself of trying to, as a parent, do these things, but telling them, you do this because I said so. And if you've ever done that to a child or to an adolescent, even to an adult, you realize sometimes people will dig their heels in just to spite you. So we really want to gear away from that mindset of telling you you should do this because. Additionally, we want to get away from the idea of like bargaining, you do this and I'll help you with that, or trying to ingratiate ourselves or coercing people through that language. The idea of making those dire threats, those dire warnings, again, not very helpful in the change conversation. So all the traditional language that we use as people sometimes isn't very helpful in the change conversation. Also imperative when we're doing motivation interviewing with our clients and other people in your life to not provide advice for them, not make suggestions for them, and not provide solutions for them. So again, it's that making sure they have the internal locus of control as opposed to you externally helping them, in your eyes, see the things they're not seeing. If we start giving advice and making suggestions for them, it's now becoming our idea, our topic, our goal for ourselves here. And we, again, really want to work away from that idea of not providing solutions for people, but helping them on their own come up with the ideas to help them move through that change. If you start arguing with people about making a change, we've already lost the battle. So again, if you find yourself arguing, say, hey, you know what, I'm getting too impassioned about this conversation right now. Let's take a step back here. Let's come at it with a level head. That's my bad. Let's come at it fresh, and let's talk about why the change is important to you. We also sometimes get in the idea of that moralizing or that preaching perspective of, well, if you don't make a change, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to have health impacts. You're going to, can't you see what's going to happen to you? And again, people sometimes, even despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, act in ways that are negative towards themselves, just to, again, show that they have control over their own behaviors. So they're digging their heels in as opposed to moving forward in the change process. So we want to try to avoid that idea of like preaching and telling people what they should or shouldn't do. Now, where motivation interviewing really comes in, I think, helpfully in the Housing First world, is Housing First really is about client-centered choice and client direction. So there are things clients I've worked with in the past have done, decisions they made, choices they made that I don't agree with. Things that I think would be a negative consequence, things that go against my values and my beliefs, and that's fine, because it's not about me, it's about them living their life. So it really is about accepting in the change conversation that people will have different beliefs, different values, different goals that they're going to work towards that may not align with what you want them to do or think they should do, and that's okay. They really get to pick their own battles here. They really get to work through the process by and for themselves. On the flip side, we also want to, not be patronizing and always, approving, praising. It shouldn't be about me accepting your goals and trying to win my approval. It should be about you deciding for yourself what's important to you to work towards, and then me helping you work towards the goals, whether I agree with you or not. It's the goals you would like to work towards. My last point there about shaming, ridiculing, labeling, ingratiating, again, those are things that, if we're truly practicing housing first in our work, shouldn't be an issue for us as well, but just as a reminder to make sure we're not confusing motivational interviewing with those practices either. Ditto with consoling and sympathizing. Again, we're trying to help people make a positive change in their life towards goals that they like to work towards, so it's not about taking pity on them, having sympathy for where they currently are. Sometimes when having the change conversation, it's difficult. We're talking about real people with real lives and real issues, and sometimes we get freaked out, and sometimes don't always want to deal with what's in front of us. So sometimes we will humor, change the subject, withdraw if we get uncomfortable. But once you've made the commitment to have the conversation, you have to stick with it. Even if it does get a little bit uncomfortable, it's really important, really imperative even, to stick with the conversation once you've started the process. Now, we all make assumptions in life, whether, and we've probably all heard the expression about what assuming does, so we want to really try to avoid or not assume things here. My first one is that we should not assume that people want to change. Now, they may be engaged in a behavior that we see, and I'll use the example of, chronic alcohol use. So again, we know the health impacts of that, the impacts on the liver, on brain functioning, on daily living skills, on possibility of employment and employability and maintaining a lease, budgeting impacts. Like, we can go through and spend an hour talking about impacts of chronic alcohol use. And that would be, an interesting hour to spend with you guys. We're not going to do that. Because we see the negative effects doesn't mean the clients we're working with agree with that, want to change because we're seeing negative things. So don't assume they want to change. To go with that, don't assume that they ought to change. Again, because we're oftentimes coming into our work with our own set of values and beliefs that make us who we are, and we see the world from our perspective. Don't assume that people share the same worldview that we share, and because they're in disagreement with us, they should change to convert to our way of thinking. So don't assume that, because we don't know the best. We may know the best for ourselves, but that's about it. Everybody else has a different story that they come to the table with of why they're acting and behaving the way they are. And again, we want to try to evoke from them why that's the case. Sometimes people do want to make a change, and they see the importance of making a change, but now is not the best time to make a change. An example I always give when I'm doing this training live is I'm a procrastinator. I wish that I wasn't. So I remember back to my days in college. It's the night before an exam, and I'm cramming in the last couple hours of studying because I didn't plan my study schedule well enough in advance. I'm not getting a good night's sleep. I'm cramming things in at the last minute. And I know, and I've said to myself a number of times, this is many years ago now, I really shouldn't do this to myself any longer here. This is not healthy for me. It's not good for me. I know better. But in that moment, deciding to change not being a procrastinator is not the best time to do that. The morning after the exam is finished, you can then think about making a change going forward. But right now, in the moment, I'm dealing with what I'm dealing with, and changing is not ideal for me right now. So perhaps a client you're working with, is chronically using alcohol to cope with and mask an underlying trauma. And so, yes, you can look at ways of getting around that, but until the trauma is dealt with, they're still going to need some way to cope with that, and they're choosing alcohol right now as their coping mechanism. So you can talk about making a change once the underlying trauma has been dealt with, but until then, now may not be the best time to talk about making a change away from that behavior. Now, I have an image as a Canadian on the call here. I was in Texas a little while ago, and I really enjoyed my time in Texas. It was hot, but I enjoyed my time there. But I have a stereotype of people from Texas, of Texans, of these, rough and tumble, cowboy rancher folks, and the idea of like being a tough Texan. And if that's the case for you, cool. If not, I'm sorry to have totally stereotyped you just then. But the idea of being tough, inspiring change. It works really well on TV shows, on scripted drama, and in fiction, but in real life, we know that being tough doesn't actually inspire change. It actually causes people to resist more than they otherwise would have, just to, prove that they have the wherewithal to make their own choices. We also know, marketing's wonderful for this. So on cigarette packaging, when they had, all the negative health impacts of cigarette smoking and secondhand smoke, people still bought cigarettes and still do. So the idea of having these doomsday scenarios, these threats to get people's attention didn't actually impact or cause change to happen. So again, we want to be mindful in our language going into a conversation with somebody that those threats are oftentimes, either useless or negative at worst. And because people are people, and we are all, wired logically, or, as human beings, sometimes we are irrational and illogical, and sometimes you can have the best laid out argument that's very logical and sensical and well-informed and well-researched, and people will still do the opposite because they're people and they're irrational. We all are. All right, you guys seeing my screen right now? I've just got a question pop up about my screen appearing black. Are we good? Just want to make sure before I move on that I'm not losing you guys here, or I've lost my slides. Okay. So Pam, are you getting the slides now? Got a couple.
Yeah, I'm seeing the screen, so I think we're okay. Just give it a second and maybe Citrix bouncing back on.
Okay, because I've got a couple people who said they're having black screens. So I'll give you guys, I'm seeing my audience view kind of bouncing from like green to red. So I'll just, it's green right now. Are we okay, guys? I don't want to like lose half of my group here. That would suck for you guys.
Okay. Pam, try logging off and logging back on. You may just get a better connection with Citrix that way.
All right, so for those who have having some black screens, try logging off and logging back on. I'll pause right now. I'll give you guys another minute or two to do that, and then I'll resume again in about a minute and a half, 2 minutes time. The absolute joy of technology is when it's not working, it's such a detriment for us here. All right, additionally, this is being recorded by the Texas Homeless Network, so if you are not getting all of this, please be mindful that we'll send you, make sure you guys get the link to the training afterwards. So if you can't see the screen right now, keep following along if you'd like to, or if you want to just log off and make sure it gets sent to you, we can be happy to do that as well. All right, I think I have all my attendees back on. Hopefully you guys have not black screens or blank screens. I'm going to keep going through the content just to be mindful of your guys' Friday schedule here as well. All right, so I mentioned earlier some of the language around MI is what we call change talk and don't change talk. So let's spend a slide here talking about what change talk looks like. So when you're working with a client or somebody in your regular personal life here, when you hear language around, now is a good time to change, or I'm getting too old for this crap, or, there's some notion of working towards a change, that's what we call change talk. And when you hear that, you really want to latch onto that and say, this is, an opportunity to have a conversation around making a change. When you hear that, it's really imperative for you then to make sure they voice the reasons why a change and the intent is theirs and not you imposing upon them. It's the idea of, hey, well, why do you feel like you're getting too old for this? Tell me more about that. Really is about evoking from them the idea of why the change is now suddenly being considered as opposed to, yesterday or last week or last month. Why is now suddenly different than it was, a short time ago? when you're hearing change talk, it's really truly imperative to help that process along through conversation. Talking about reasons why it's a change, why now is a better time than it was before, helping strengthen the desire to make a change, and again, really increasing or securing the idea of making a commitment to making that change. And I'll give you a non-housing example for you guys here, because I think we can all kind of relate to this one. So you'll notice that the first week of January, most sporting goods stores will have a massive sale on all their exercise equipment, exercise apparel. You can buy a pair of gym shorts and free weights and an elliptical or whatever, like half price in January. Because they're capitalizing on the idea of everyone making resolutions for New Year's to say, I want to get healthier this year, I want to drop 5 pounds, I want to work on my whatever. And so you have the idea of change talk happening with your resolutions, and then trying to increase the commitment to making the change. We're going to sell you stuff that you may not have otherwise gotten because you're now having the idea of making a change. So when you, again, hear from people the idea of now is a good time to change, you really want to help strengthen the idea of making that change with them. Now on the flip side, the idea of don't change talk, it can happen for many reasons. We'll address those later today. But the idea of change now becomes we're going to resist towards the idea of change. So, because change is difficult, change is hard, and we've all gone through a change in our lives. We can certainly respect the idea of change being difficult and hard. So when that does happen, we really want to make sure that we're not pushing back too hard. We're not really pushing away. We're helping them again align to the values and why the change was being discussed in the first place. So when you see things like people digging their heels in or resisting or pushing away, that's some don't change talk. We don't want to ignore it. We want to call it what it is. So hey, it sounds like now you're having some uncertainty, some ambivalence towards the change. Let's talk through that. Why are you feeling that way now? And again, not telling them, oh, you shouldn't feel that way, but again, tell me more about why you're feeling this way, so we can work through your feelings around what that looks like for you. So really, again, drawing forth the idea of tell me more about that. Now, motivational interviewing has a number of principles. Well, not a number, there are 4 here. The idea of expressing empathy. So, and we'll dig through these ones a little bit more in depth after my splash slide here, but expressing empathy, supporting what we call self-efficacy. It's a really fun term to say there, self-efficacy. And now motivational interviewing has changed over the years, and so the same idea is expressed in 2 different terms here. So we've had training on MI before. You may have heard the term rolling with resistance. If you've had it more recently, you will have heard the term dancing with discord. But essentially, it refers to the same idea, just expressed in 2 different ways. And the 4th principle there is what we call developing discrepancy. Now a bit more on empathy itself here. Now empathy, as opposed to sympathy, involves seeing the world from someone else's perspective. So again, walking a mile in their shoes, seeing things how they see things, thinking about things how they think through things. The idea of shared experience here, as opposed to really trying to impose my beliefs and here's what you should do. It's tell me how you feel. I want to see the world from your perspective. And again, that really does parallel nicely with the idea of housing first, in the sense of we're really trying to help clients find the motivation to work towards goals on their own, having the motivation to find the housing success supports they're going to have. But before we can do that, we really have to get a perspective of how they're seeing things. Now, I fundamentally believe one of the strongest human desires, regardless of who you are, where you're from in the world, is to be understood, to be listened to be understood, to have the idea of, my story is important and I want someone to understand it or hear it. And so when people do express genuine interest in hearing where you're coming from, you're more likely to open up to them and be more honest with them and share your deeper experiences and your deeper values, because you feel like somebody actually wants to hear me, so I'm going to tell you. And so in motivational interviewing, the idea of building that empathetic conversation is really about being genuine in your approach and saying, I really do care about you, I want to hear what's going on, tell me more about that, and being truly genuine in our approach with empathy. Now my fun term to say that the idea of supporting self-efficacy Again, MI being a strengths-based approach, we really do believe that people have it within themselves to make the change, and all the ideas, all the capacities and capabilities are already built in. And one of the things we do with self-efficacy is we look at past successes and say, well, you've made the change in your past at some point in time. You can think back long enough, you've made some successful change at least once in your life. How'd you do that? You know, what skills did you have? What was it about that change that you're able to do? And what can we draw forth from that with this change we're considering right now? So, you know, another housing example here, if somebody is having a hard time budgeting for the rent because their money is going towards, randomly here, I'm just naming an example, going towards substance use. I'll stick with that one. So if they're spending more money on alcohol. So can't pay the rent because all the money is going out the door towards alcohol. But in the past, they made changes towards, you know, they wanted to save up for a new TV. Again, another random example on a Friday for you guys here. So you can draw forth from, well, how'd you do that? You know, what did you change to save up for that TV? What's different this time for you here? What was important to you about the TV, and can we like parallel that to your housing here, so you get the idea of you made a change in the past you're successful with, and how can you do that going forward with this change you'd like to work towards. So our role really becomes as a cheerleader and a coach to say, you know, change is possible. It's within you to make the change, and yes, it may be difficult, but you've done it before, and I believe you can do it again. So oftentimes it really is about trying to find those hidden or those inner strengths that we may have overlooked or have not really found as being important at this point in time, but really why it's important to make the change and the successes you can draw forth from the past into helping that process go along here. Now, our rolling with resistance and dancing with discord, we recognize in motivational interviewing that there will be ambivalence to change. There will be some pushback. No matter how committed people are to making a change, at some point there'll be some pushback, at least on some level. And so rather than glossing over and saying, well, when it happens, we'll deal with it, we're saying, hey, we recognize that, we acknowledge that, and we're going to plan for that through the MI process here. So we're not trying to be confrontational in our approach, but rather collaborative. We call rolling with it or dancing with it when those negative reactions do pop up. We're not trying to have a dynamic of power to say, well, you said this and you need to stick with it, and man up to your commitments that you said you're going to make here, because we're going to push people away doing that. So it really is about the idea of, okay, well, now you're unsure. Before you talked about making the change because it was important to your overall health, you mentioned being the best parent you could be. You mentioned being healthy for yourself. You mentioned, and again, pulling back to things they've already expressed to us to reconnect on that commitment to making a change. The final principle here is what we call developing discrepancy. And here we're looking for or identifying that what they're saying they'd like to have happen, what they're currently doing, there's a gap, there's a mismatch. So you say you want to pay your rent on time and in full every month as part of your case plan, and yet you're currently spending more money than you have coming in on your alcohol addiction. So what's how do we get from spending the money where you currently are to where you want it to be? What's happening with that? And so instead of, again, trying to impose our will on them, we're really talking about how does this align with your values? And I'll give you an example from a job I had in the past. I was working in a parenting support program, and so a mom I was working with had her kids in temporary foster care, and she really wanted to get her kids back and be the best mom that she could be. And so part of her agreement with Children's Services was to have, she smoked a lot of marijuana, was to have a clean drug test. Every time she, to get her kids back, she had to have 3 clean drug tests in a row. And so every time I'd see her and she was smoking pot, I'd be saying, okay, you want to get your kids back. You mentioned how important it is to be the best mom you can be. Please tell me right now how, smoking pot right now, is helping you get your kids back, because, you have to have clean drug tests. So I get the idea you're coping with your stress by using pot. On the other hand, you want to get your kids back, and those things aren't the same. So which one's more important to you? And how can we strengthen your commitment to making a change right now? So, again, pulled it back to not saying it's an unhealthy behavior and I didn't lecture her. It's simply a, hey, I'm confused. You want to get your kids back out of care. I get that. But you're smoking pot right now and those things don't align. So help me understand, the motivation behind what you're doing right now. And that was, able to help her, see from her perspective that one really did lead to the other. She hadn't made that mental connection at that point in time. So when we see, when it's pointed out to us in a positive way as opposed to a threatening way, that our current behavior is not jiving with our values or our goals and our beliefs, we're more likely to have that internal desire to change when we're seeing things happen like that. So it's really about having them grasp and have the aha moment of, oh, wait a second, what I'm doing right now isn't getting me what I want. I should change what I'm doing to get what I want. All right. So talking through the spirit of MI, it really is about a collaborative process as opposed to a confrontational process. And we oftentimes get caught up in the idea of, well, we have funders we're accountable to, we have case funds we have to work on here, we have landlords who want things from us. We have to be confrontational to make sure people are complying. And again, the idea of Housing First being a non-compliance model, it really is about working collaboratively as opposed to confrontationally through the change process. I believe anybody on the call today really does have within themselves all the skills they need to make a change in their life without me imposing my ideas and my values on you guys. So it's really acknowledging that, accepting that everybody, has it within themselves to make those changes. And me trying to be authoritative, besides people laughing at me because I'm not really, a large guy and authority doesn't really sit well with me, but I really do promote autonomy. I want people to be the best version of themselves that they can become. And part of that is recognizing that, we have different ideas sometimes, and that's okay. We're different people. Now, before I dive into a couple of examples from Housing First practice, any questions from the group so far? My chat box has kind of gone quiet, but are you guys okay content-wise? Is this making sense to you before I move on? I just want to make sure that we're doing okay here. And again, I can't read your guys' minds, so if you have questions, please type them in. If not, I will assume shortly here that we are good to move on, and I will start proceeding with some Housing First examples of when MI would be an appropriate intervention to use. Now, obviously, there are some situations where you can't have a collaborative change conversation. There are things, like major safety concerns where you have to sometimes impose things, or things are more directive. As a parent, you don't talk to your children who are running out in traffic about, is that really aligning with your values of being a healthy, 5-year-old? You save them from getting run over, and talk later on about why that may be a bad idea. But sometimes motivational reviewing is not the right tool in the toolbox. It's just one more approach you guys can take. All right, so I've had no questions typed in, so I'm assuming I'm good to move on here, or everyone's fallen asleep, one or the other. But from there, a couple of examples when MI would be appropriate. So if you're engaged in the outreach process, if your role is outreach, and you're working with somebody who's homeless, but they're not engaging with outreach. So again, you could, track them down and see why outreach is an issue for them. What about it are you concerned about? What about it is scary for you? Why are we not following through with outreach supports here? If you're homeless but not engaged with a housing program, so yes, you've identified housing is important to you, but you're not engaged with the supports that can actually get you housed. So again, what's the drawback here? So a good conversation around, you're currently homeless, you want to be housed. There's a program that does that for you guys. Have you heard about that? What are your thoughts about that? What are your concerns about that? Tell me more about that. We often find this comes up. So recently housed but no longer engaging with supports. So you got yourself through the intake process, you got yourself screened, you got yourself housed, wonderful. Now that you're housed, you've pulled back. What's going on? Why is this change suddenly happening? What's scary about being housed for you or scary about case management for you? Let's talk through that. Both a housing example and a regular example, so someone who's sick but not engaged with healthcare. What are the reasons behind that? It might be a lack of coverage, it might be a lack of access. might be, you know, a fear of getting bad news. It might be a fear of the medical field in general. But again, you can talk about why, you know, if they want to live a long, healthy life, how is disengaging from healthcare supports going to help them with those things? So it's really about trying to be the example there. Sometimes you have clients who are HIV positive, still engaged in sex work and not always using condoms. So again, the idea of trying to create a healthy community, if that's important to them, how does the notion of providing sex work without protection helping you be part of that larger, safer, healthy community here? And potentially being exposed to other things. If you're HIV positive, you may end up with another infection that could cause, you know, detrimental effects to your own well-being while you're being treated with the HIV. A few more examples from the housing world. Sometimes you have clients who party in their apartment, you know, it's party central, and they disagree with the landlord that the other tenants are being impacted by it. You know, hey, they don't mind, they like my music very much. I've got good music. So sometimes you get that notion of what's going on isn't always consistent with what you're seeing or hearing. Recently released from incarceration, but not regularly meeting with a parole officer. And again, there's a notion of there's a condition or a consequence for not doing that, and a very non-motivational reviewing style there with parole. I mean, there's rules and regulations they have to adhere to. So again, if the value for them is to not go back to jail, how does not meeting with the parole officer align with the value of not going back to jail? Because there's discrepancy there, and trying to have a conversation around that discrepancy. Some of those folks who have recently been housed, you know, there's not a lot of social support, so they're lonely, but not trying to, you know, meaningfully engage or find meaningful activities to connect with other people and other supports. So you're saying you're alone and isolated here, but you're not doing anything to, you know, address that or change that. So what's going on with that? To my example earlier about, you know, chronic alcohol use, you know, failing liver, but still drinking heavily, and again, talking about the idea of a prolonged life and having things to look forward to, and then drinking getting in the way of doing, you know, those things, because there's going to be negative health consequence due to that, which will, you know, be a drawback on them doing the things they'd like to do with their lives. Final example I'm just going to share with you guys here, one of the appropriate. So getting beaten up by the neighbors, but you want to, you know, keep the peace in the building. So you don't want to be the tenant, you know, who's causing issues and you know, havoc with the landlord or with the workers, but you're still getting beat up by your neighbors, and that's a problem. So how do you, you know, stay healthy and protected and safe while still being what you think is being a peaceful, calm neighbor? So again, some examples of when MI would be appropriate to use with your clients in your work. I mean, I could think of dozens more right now, but again, the idea of it's a tool that can be used when having the change conversation. Now, MI is a 4-step process here. And the order is in sequence, and we'll go through the steps here. But it's really important that we don't get them out of sequence. So you don't want to start planning for a change before you've done the engaging, focusing, and evoking. You don't start evoking before you've engaged. You don't put planning somewhere else. I mean, it's important to go through these steps in order. So the first step is to engage, follow that up with focusing, follow that up with evoking, and follow that up with planning, and that's our 4-step process here. Now, step 1 is the engaging process. And it is just what it says. It's really about building rapport and building a relationship with your client. And if you've already established that, then you are already, you know, down the road as far as being successful with motivation, because you can draw back on the examples you've already covered. You can talk about, you know, values and goals and beliefs you've already learned about and heard about when talking about making a change going forward. But if you're meeting a client for the first time, you have to really start building that relationship from day one. Now again, recognizing that people are people and there's conflicts that will arise. We're being person-centered without being person-directed. So sometimes we have to say, hey, my role as your worker is to do this, you know, not to do that. And there's conflict sometimes around that. So you're not there to be at their beck and call and be their servant. You have a role and a job to fulfill. So sometimes you have to, you know, keep it about them, but not let them, you know, always take the lead on things. What you can do is keep bringing new information to the table and the conversation to help, again, promote change. Hey, did you hear about this? Or I'm not sure if you know about this, but, or, if you weren't aware of this, in the past, here's some information that might be helpful in deciding, your next course of action here. So it really is about trying to, create that change impetus with new information. Now, I've hearkened and harped on a while here the idea of understanding their values, their beliefs, their hopes, their dreams. I mean, it sounds kind of touchy-feely and wishy-washy here, but it really is about, I mean, sincerely, it really is about understanding them as a person. People are people, and so if you can help connect with them, build that relationship, they're more likely to buy into what you're saying and be open to your conversation if you spend the time investing in them as a human being beforehand. I can't stress enough how important that part is here. So a few tips on engaging for you. If this is an area where you sometimes struggle, a couple quick tips. So again, seek a genuine connection, ask questions, get to know the person at least a little bit. And again, if it's the first interaction you're having with them, if you haven't met them before, the idea really is just tell me more about you. I want to know more about you. I mentioned earlier that I think one of the fundamental things about the human condition is the idea of wanting to be heard, understood, listened to. So again, really recognizing that, and then in the way you handle your conversations, being part of that. And again, you don't have to agree with everything they're doing, everything they believe in, but you need to at least accept that they have goals and values that may differ from yours, and that's okay. I don't want the whole world to be like me because it'd be a very boring world. I like variety. My values work really well for me. Sometimes they change when I learn new information, and I don't want to impose my values on anybody else here. So the idea of accepting that truly at face value. So after you've engaged, you built a relationship and the rapport, you're going to start focusing as the next step here. So there's a shift in conversation when we've gone from the engaging to the focusing. You really want, and you'll hear, I mean, there's this clarifying of what the goal actually is. So the idea of, oh, I'm getting told for this crap. Okay, well, I get the idea of what this crap is, and suddenly we're talking about a specific goal to change towards, and that's when we'll start focusing in on and honing in on the idea of making a change and what that actually is going to be. As opposed to the scattershot approach of making a change, we really want to focus in a clear direction of what that change will look like. So, a couple tips for focusing for you guys. Sometimes when talking about values and goals, we get consumed. We're having a good conversation, we're getting to know people, but our role times is really to rein in the enthusiasm and pick one target behavior to work towards. So as opposed to I want to change everything, okay, well, everything's a lot. Let's pick one thing to work on right now, and let's focus on that. And once that one's addressed, let's do something else. But for now, we need to focus on one specific behavior or activity. With focusing, sometimes, again, with the idea of reining in, you have to kind of put your foot down and help direct the conversation without imposing your own perspective. And there's a bit of a balance there. So it's not about, again, trying to tell them that they're right or that they're wrong. It's simply saying, I love the enthusiasm, but we need to focus in on a couple things. So what do you want to focus on first, as opposed to you should focus on this first, but really having them pick the focus of what's going to happen next. So once we've focused and we've got a clear change behavior, a clear goal in mind, we're going to stop drinking, we're going to send out some resumes, we're going to go on housing viewings, we're going to meet with a parole officer, we're going to whatever the goal is. We've now focused and clarified what that goal is specifically. We now need to evoke the change strengthening process. So we really want to, we call again, strengthen the change talk. So again, having ideas of why it's important to them, bring it back to the values conversation again. Well, you mentioned this is an important value to you, and this aligns nicely with your goal. Let's focus on that. Now, during the evoking process is when you're most likely going to run into the idea of resistance or discord or ambivalence. And so that's what we really want to work on here, is the idea of targeting and focusing in on when those things do occur, how to get past that. We're not going to ignore it. We're going to roll with it. We're going to dance with it. We're going to move past that. And I'll talk about how to do that a little later on. So really your role here is, it's a multifaceted role. You can be at times part cheerleader, part motivator, part facilitator, part coach. Really, you kind of adapt what you're doing to what they need you to be for them at that point in time, trying to strengthen the idea of why a change is good, you know, from their values, from their beliefs. Why is it a good idea to make this change right now? When those things do pop out, the idea of ambivalence and discord, don't get frustrated. Accept it, acknowledge it, prepare for it, plan for it, and help them work through it. Finally, our last step of planning. So we've done the engaging, we've focused, we've evoked, now we're going to plan. And planning really is about, you know, putting down a concrete plan of action or course of action. And again, not having it not come from you. You can be the scribe for it, but not having it there. And we're more likely to follow through with things if we actually have a plan in place, a concrete plan to touch, to hold, like a written down plan, because it's real, it's tangible. So having that plan in place will strengthen the commitment to change even more than just talking about it, because we have actually written it down, and therefore it's, you know, we psychologically think it's important. If it's written down, we should, you know, do something about it. I've got this plan on paper, I should like change, do something. So the plan here really is about, again, drawing out what's gone on for them and making change. It's only possible when you've had enough engagement, you've created a common shared goal, and enough motivation to make a change here. So a few tips for you guys on how to do the actual planning. As I mentioned a moment ago, you might be scribing that for them, but the idea, the actual plan should be theirs. So making sure it's not you telling them the goal they should be working on, but you just, you know, facilitating that process where they're actually telling you what they would like to do next. We sometimes, in the fast-paced nature of our work, really want to get through the change and get through the planning really quickly, because, you know, we have things to do, we have appointments to keep, we have other people to see. But if you start planning too soon, you're going to lose the momentum, and it's going to, you know, fall apart, and you're going to have difficulty talking about it again, because you'll have the negative historical reference point. So make sure you have enough. We'll talk about the rulers in a little bit here, but make sure there's enough commitment, enough confidence, enough readiness to make the change before you start making a plan for it. Also, sometimes we get over, you know, we want to make a big change and we get excited about it and we don't do enough focusing. Sometimes what we do is we end up having a very general goal as opposed to a very specific goal. So you would like to, you know, have very specific goals. The example I gave is I will send out 5 resumes each week, as opposed to I will, you know, find the perfect job. You know, both are around employment, but one's very specific, one is very general. And so the general job is very hard to actually track progress on. And if it's not achieved right away, you could lose momentum, you could lose interest, and so the goal becomes, you know, moot, as it's like, I don't, you know, no longer happening for me here, and that change talk will start to dwindle if you've set yourself up to fail with too broad of a goal. So really imperative to have that very specific goal, because you can track down, hey, last week you sent in your resumes, yep, how many, was it 5, was it more, was it less? You can actually track that very specifically. Once resumes start going out, you can talk about, I'd like to improve my interviewing skills as another goal. So you can talk about going, like, you know, interviewing workshops, or, you know, mock interviews or practice interviews, so they can be prepared for when they start getting callbacks from the resumes going out. Again, steps on a larger journey here, but if you go too broad, sometimes you lose momentum because it's hard to achieve such a broad goal. So again, the order is important, and the first two, the engaging, the focusing, are really about building that relationship, and the last two are really about that true motivational interviewing process where you're evoking your planning. So the evoking, again, the drawing forth ideas to work on towards the plan, but you can't do that until you've actually built a relationship, built some rapport, and have an idea of where the goal is going to, you know, work towards there. All right. Before I move on, we're about halfway through our time allotment here, Any questions from anybody, still on the call here? I've got a couple people bouncing off and on here. Any questions from you guys to chat about anything that you want me to cover again, or just highlight or speak to again? I'll give you guys a minute to think through that or process that. Let me know if you have any questions. All right, either a very engaged audience or everyone's kind of started to tune me out already here on a Friday, as no more questions have popped up in my question box here. All right. All right. Okay. Change being difficult. Nope. Can't run my screen all of a sudden here. We know from our own lives and our own experiences here that the status quo is comfortable. Now, it may not be ideal, it may not be healthy, it may not be successful, it may not be positive, but we know what to expect. If you've worked with people who've experienced domestic violence or have had to flee domestic violence, we know that there's a number of times, I've heard different numbers, whether it's 5 times, 7 times, 9 times, but we know the idea of it's difficult for people to leave because as bad as it may be, there's still the notion of there's predictability to it. And so we really want to make sure that sorry, I lost my train of thought there. We really want to make sure that the change behavior we're talking about here, we're going to talk about the uncertainty of what's going to happen. We're going to acknowledge that, we're going to be aware of that to make sure that, when those scary new things start happening, we've planned for it here. And the idea of sometimes the change itself isn't what we're resisting. We acknowledge, we accept the idea of a change is important, it's necessary, it's now's a good time. It's the actual transition or the process of making the change that's difficult for us here. And you've probably heard the example or the analogy, if you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, he'll jump out and save himself. If you put a frog in a pot of room temperature water and then gradually raise the temperature, he will, adapt to it, adjust to it, and actually boil to death because, there's been no drastic or dramatic change for him. It's a gradual thing. So again, we really want to make sure that when we're talking about change, we're acknowledging that people are going to have difficulty with that, and that's okay. One of the mistakes we get into, though, is thinking more of the technical process of, well, is this the steps here, as opposed to recognizing it's really the adaptive reality. So we need to, again, try to figure out where people are at with the change being looked at. So to be successful, there are 3 core elements to helping people overcome that difficulty, that transition, or that notion of change being difficult here. And the 3 things are importance, confidence, and readiness. Now, I mentioned those earlier here, but those are, again, 3 really important things. It's how important is the change for you, how confident you feel making the change, and how ready are you to make the change a part of your life. Now, the first one we're gonna tackle here is what we call importance. Now, when looking at how important change is to you, and I'm gonna have you guys spend a moment or two shortly here thinking about a change you recently made or you're thinking about making, and talk yourself through it here. But when looking at importance, there are 3 factors you want to consider. The first of all is, reasons for making the change. So why would I make the change? So I'll go back to my housing first examples, and I'll pick the idea of we've engaged with outreach. We are looking for housing. We're still homeless. We're trying to find housing. And so why would I consider being housed? So what are all the reasons why housing is a better option than being outside right now or being in a shelter right now? So what's the rationale behind that one? And again, there's many possible answers. So you may hear things like, I don't have to worry about paying rent. Right now, I'm comfortable being in the shelter. I'm comfortable living outside. I'm living in Texas, where it's, I don't have to worry about like freezing most nights. Yeah, it's hot, but I can deal with the heat. Why do I want to have the hassle of a landlord, neighbors? Why? So again, the adaptive reality of why is making a change important to you. On the flip side of that one, why is housing important to you now? Well, I'm getting kind of old. Living outside is difficult. I don't have a place to put all my stuff every night. I keep getting attacked or beaten up or mugged by people because I'm outside. It's not safe for me here. I'm around people who are unhealthy for me. I'm trying to maintain sobriety, and I'm around people who are using. So again, the idea of if I have my own place, I can control some of those events. So you look for the reasons behind a change. Why would I? The second factor with importance is the need. Should I? So again, trying to get the idea of, not you imposing on them, but like, should you be housed right now? What are the benefits? What are the drawbacks? Which outweighs the other one here? Is there a need to be housed as opposed to staying outside where you currently are? And finally, we need to recognize the desire. Do I want to? Because again, we can think as a housing worker, it's just intuitive. It makes sense to us. Of course you should be housed. Of course it's important to be housed. Why wouldn't you want to be housed? But if they haven't been housed for a while, we need to ask, like, what was appealing to you about living outside? What was appealing to you about not having your own place? Help me understand, the motivation behind that. And it could be, likely it's many different factors at play here. But to overcome that, we need to ask, like, do you want to be housed now? What about now is different than what it was last week or last month? Why now? So take a moment and think through a change you recently considered making, or recently made, or might be considered making, and consider the importance to you. So how important was the change to make to you guys? What were your reasons behind making the change? What was the need for the change? What was the desire for the change? And just take a moment. I'm just going to scroll through my questions to make sure nothing popped up. And just, go through the idea of the change for yourselves here. I'm sorry, Laura, I didn't see your question earlier about, falling into the therapist role. So I'll address that now. Probably earlier on in the conversation around, helping people through the change. Me personally, I don't find it difficult to not be in the therapist role, because for me, it's really about helping people work through the change themselves. But it very easily could fall into the therapist role, trying to help people see why the change is important for us there. All right. So with the idea of importance under our belts, let's move on to confidence. So once we've identified how important the change is to make, we're going to talk about how confident they feel making the change. So as with importance, there are three factors to consider. First is the ability. So can I make the change? So we're looking for, again, drawing forth past successes they've had, and really wanting to evoke from them the sense of you've accomplished things in the past. Of course you can do this again here. It may be difficult, but you've shown you have the wherewithal to do that. But again, trying to overcome the idea of lack of confidence here and the ability. Also important to recognize with confidence is the idea of hope. So will things get better? Could they get better if I do the change? So again, back to our housing example here. So if I move from the shelter into housing here, will I be healthier? Will it be more positive for me? Will I be safer? Will I be happier? Can things be better by having my own place? And again, the answer to us may seem, obvious, but to somebody who's, not been housed for a period of time, it's not so obvious. We actually have to get past the idea of, the change can actually be beneficial and helpful. Our final factor with confidence here is the belief or expectation. So can this help? So it's similar to the idea of hope, but again, the idea of creating an expectation of positive outcome going forward here. So think again of the change you have either considered recently or made recently, and ask yourself, how confident you felt in making the change. Did you feel you could do it? Did you have hope that by making the change, things are going to get better for you? Did you have the belief or expectation that this would be helpful for you once you actually made the change? I'll let that sit for a moment there while you guys are pondering the important life changes you guys have made recently, and then I'll move on here to the idea of readiness. So we may recognize the importance of making a change. Yeah, I need to, it's going to be better for my health if I find housing here. I don't want to be outside any longer. It's not good for me in the long term. I feel confident. I'm absolutely ready. I feel great about doing that. I feel like I can make, but is now the right time? So when overcoming the idea of readiness, we need to talk about what we call option strategy. So how will I do this? How will I maintain housing? How will I find housing? How will I get through the idea of being housed? And again, not a major thing, but you also want to recognize and make sure that we are, going through the process of identifying how important this is and what we can do to help overcome that idea of lack of confidence. Will I maintain it? Will I stick to it? Is the commitment there for making a change or not? And is now the best time? If not now, then when? So the idea of prioritizing, if now is the right time to make a change. So finally, think back to the change you've made recently. Ask yourself, if not now, then when? Did you feel ready for it? Was now the right time? And the example I always give with this one, not always, but quite often give this one, is the idea of, people who try to quit smoking. And the idea essentially comes down to, we've heard if you've smoked yourself, you've probably tried to quit a number of times. If you've had friends or family who've gone through the process of quitting smoking, they know the health impacts. You could give them all the data, all the research in the world, and they know those things. But the idea behind that being is now the right time to make a change. Like my dad smokes. He's been smoking, I don't know, probably for 50 years. He tried quitting 3 or 4 times. He keeps talking about it. He'll get a book. He'll listen to an audio program. He knows the health impacts, but now is not the right time. He's got stress at work. He's trying to retire. Quitting smoking now, it's kind of his crutch right now as far as how he gets through his day. So now is not the right time for him. So trying to figure out how we draw forth from that the idea of being ready for it. Now, with the idea of our importance, confidence, and readiness, we have what we call readiness rulers. Now, if you've done MI before, this is not like a new, earth-shattering technique, but it's, again, something that I find very effective in the work that we do. It really simply it's a ruler. And so for each of the 3 factors, we need to understand and assess their readiness to make that change. So again, we use the readiness rulers for that purpose, and we really understand their importance, their confidence, and their readiness to do that. So once we have talked and we've got the change in place, we're going through the focusing process here. We've got a specific change behavior in mind. So I'll stick with the idea of being housed from outside. So on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not very and 10 being very much so, how important is it for you to find housing? On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not very much and 10 being very much so, how important is it to you to stop smoking? How important is it to you to exercise 3 days a week? How important is it to you to send out 5 resumes per week? How important is that change to you? And again, we don't have the answer. We have to ask for that. The whole idea is we're not trying to assume that they ought to make a change. We need to ask them how important that change is to them. And the response we're going to get, and we'll talk about what happens with the numbers afterwards, but the response is important as far as what we do next. So then we ask on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not very much and 10 being very much so, how confident do you feel in making this change a part of your life? So with 1 being not very much and 10 being very much so, how confident do you feel in finding and maintaining housing for yourself, through our program? How confident do you feel in quitting smoking or smoking, 1 cigarette less per day? How confident do you feel in losing 5 pounds in the next 2 months? How confident do you feel in, sending out 5 resumes per week? Whatever the change is, how confident do you feel in making that change a part of your life? And finally, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not very much and 10 being very much so, how ready are you to make this change a part of your life? How ready do you feel you are to, find your own place, move into your own place and be successful there? How ready are you to quit smoking? How ready are you to lose 5 pounds? How ready are you to send out 5 resumes per week? And if not now, then when? So we ask those 3 questions with our rulers. And from there, we have them placed into one of three areas with the numbers we're going to get back. Now, if they want to use like decimals or fractions, like I'm 3.5 or I'm 9.4, that's fine. We don't need to have like whole numbers. It's whatever they want to do. If you have people who have literacy or numeracy concerns, you can use like an actual scale with like different levels of happy faces or different levels of change. I've seen various things being used, but whatever, there's a visual representation of their self-assessment of how those things play into their life. So they're at a 1 to 3. We're in the bottom third of our ruler. They're not ready. There's no desire, there's no intention to take an action. They're telling you the change is important because they think you want to hear that way, or they've been told they should stop smoking, so they're going to talk about stopping smoking, but really, they're not ready for it, they're not ready for it. And you can try as hard as you want to, you're not going to have a lot of success. So if that's the case, you have a lot of not readies in your importance and confidence and readiness, find a different goal through your evoking and focusing process there to really have a different goal to work towards. They're going to feel more ready to work on. If they're in the 4 to 7 range, there's some ambivalence and unsurety here. So thinking about making a change, which is great. But again, the idea is we're really not sure yet if that's the right thing to make or the right thing to do, so we're unsure. And a lot of people will end up kind of in the middle there because, again, a lot of uncertainty. Those who are scoring the 8 to 10 range, they're ready. So again, we can start, moving to this point into the planning process here because we're ready to make a change. It's important to us. We're confident in it. We feel ready to do it. Let's roll. Now, there's nothing good or bad about being not ready or unsure or ready. There's nothing right or wrong. It's simply assessing where they currently are. It's a snapshot in time. If you think about like the map at the mall or at the airport that says you are here, we're trying to find out where here is. So for my dad, who is smoking and has been smoking for decades now, there's nothing wrong with him being not ready. Inherently, there's nothing good or bad about that lack of readiness for it. Do I know the health impacts? Yes, I do. Do I know what could happen to him? Yes, I do. Does he? Yes, he does. But the idea is if he's not ready for it now, me lecturing him or hectoring him about, well, you really should do this, Dad, it's not going to help. It's how can we, in our relationship, try to get him from not ready to at least being unsure or ambivalent, from being ambivalent then to being ready. So moving up the ruler level there. Now, once we see where they are, that's step one. We're not done yet, though. There's more work to be done once we self-assess and figure out where people are on our scale. There are 2 follow-up questions you need to ask with every ruler. So of the 3 scores you have, you need to figure out where we're going next. And those 2 questions are going to really determine what happens next from there. So the first one is, why are you a blank and not lower? And unless they scored 1, you can ask them, well, why do you see yourself as being a 1 and not any higher than that? So, why are you a 3 and not a 2? So again, looking at current strengths and, not saying, why are you 3 not like a 10? Like, why are you 3 not a 2? Like, what gets you as high as a 3? What gets you as high as a 7? What gets you as high as a 6? And as opposed to a 5 or lower, like, why are you here and not lower? So really understanding from their perspective how good they feel about making the change and why they would place them where they currently are. Next question is, what would it take, what would you need to move from a 3 to a 4? Now, again, we're not going to be drastic and say from a 3 to a 10. We're going to look at small incremental changes here, getting the idea of adaptive reality. What would it take for you to get from a 3 to a 4? Because again, going from a 3 to a 10, that's a big deal. That's overwhelming. That's a lot. A 3 to a 4, I can do that. It's not too bad. I can probably handle that. But the idea of that drastic change is not ideal for us here. So again, looking at small steps, how can we do that? All right. When we have people, when we're talking about importance here, so again, we've gone through our rulers here, we've got a scoring the importance. Sometimes when we're talking about the importance, if we see it as a low level, so our 1, 2, and 3s, sometimes even like, like the lower of our ambivalence or the unsures, like a 4 or a 5, we can fall into the trap of thinking this in a non-MI mindset and saying, well, you're in denial. You're just resisting change. If you knew better, if you knew what was going on for you, you would want to change. And we really want to as an MI practitioner here, take it at face value. Okay, right now, stopping smoking, finding housing, quitting drinking, paying your rent on time and in full, not that important to you. Do I think it should be? Yeah, personally, in my back mind, I'm thinking that, yeah, I think so, but I need to recognize it's not my life. I'm there to help the change process go forward here, but I also need to make sure that they're not being pushed away by me by doing that. So take it at face value. We then, as part of the discrepancy building here, I saw a comment in the question box about cognitive dissonance, and this is where it fits in here. So you mentioned you want to have money to, buy other things, to budget for other things, and you spend all your money on cigarettes. How does smoking cigarettes and paying for cigarettes jive with you trying to save it for other things? How does you not paying your rent on time and in full help you be the ideal tenant you'd like to be, or be successfully, stably housed long term if you're not paying your rent? Please help me understand what's going on, because I'm not seeing it here. So again, you're trying to draw back to the values you've already brought forth in the engaging process here of why that change is important to them. That's why it's important to build a relationship at the beginning to fall back on and say, you said these things earlier that are important to you. Now that you've mentioned that here, and here's the goal you're working towards, how do these things align to each other? With confidence, we know from our own experiences here, and we know from the research that people are more likely to make a change or follow through a change, and sometimes a difficult change, when there's a belief that things can get better, or at least be different. If there's the belief that, if I'll try to find another housing example that's a little bit different here. The example we had, the last example of the guy who gets beat up by the neighbors but wants to keep the peace in the building here. If he wants to not have that happen anymore, if he wants to not get beat up because getting beat up sucks, if he doesn't believe that having a conversation around that or confronting people around that's going to change anything, there's no confidence in moving forward with that goal. So there has to be the internal belief that if I take an action here, if I talk to the landlord, if I talk to my neighbors, if I talk to my work, if I talk to the police about things can change. If there's no sense, like, why bother? Then you're less likely to actually follow through if there's the sense of why bother. Now, if we're in the why bother, sometimes we see the importance of making a change, but if there's no sense of it's going to make a difference, we can rationalize a lot of things. We can deny a lot of things. We can project sometimes and displace things as well as a way of defending our lack of action or lack of movement here. Rationalizing, well, if I just talk to, my neighbor's the landlord, I'm just going to beat up even worse. So at least it's, it's not bad now. I can live with it now. It could get worse if I say anything about it. So the idea of rationalizing the behavior or the not changing behavior because there's no sense of hope. So it's really about working on goals and having the idea of confidence. They're going to have some progress here. And sometimes as a worker, it's important for us to share the idea of confidence and look at past actions they've taken and past changes they made that have led to a change. And finally, with the rulers and readiness here, we may see the importance of something, we may see, feel confident in doing it, but now may not be the right time. Procrastination, not taking action right now may not be the right time. And that's why having a jotted down or a written down plan is important, because you can put like a date on that one. And you make a commitment to that and say, we've written this plan down, it's tangible, it's real, there's a date here to work towards, you've got steps along the way here to follow through. So again, if you feel a lack of excitement or a lack of inertia here, you can move through the steps here that we've set out, that you've set out to help the plan come to fruition. All right, now sometimes we get stuck in the conversation, and it's helpful to know how to move the conversation forward here. And again, this is for motivational reviewing. I'm not going to take credit for the ORS, but ORS is an acronym that stands for open questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summaries. And if you've done any social worker training in the past, or a lot of PD in your positions, you will have come across this at some point in time. So just as a reminder for you guys about the ORS. So open questions, and again, not trying to belittle your knowledge level here, but just again making sure we're clear on this. Open questions are those not easily answered by a yes or a no. So, did you have chicken for supper last night? That's a yes or no question. What did you have for supper last night? That's an open question. Did you like the movie? That's a yes or no question. What were the best parts of the movie for you? Again, open question. And again, I'm coming away from the housing examples here, but just giving you an idea of what open questions would be there for you. The idea is to, again, have people think a bit deeper on the response and provide more information for us. So we're trying to invite the elaboration through our open-ended questions. And again, if we're simply having yes or no or a question answer trap with that, we're not going to get to the idea of actually understanding the rationale or the reasons behind making a change, or, you know, a possibility of making a change if we're simply asking yes or no questions. With affirmations, it's also important, I mean, there's statements to recognize a person's strengths, but it's also imperative to not overdo it and be disingenuous in our affirmations. Because people will see through that and then suddenly they'll think like you're treating me like a child because you think, hey, a pat on the head, good job, Jeff, you got up and you tied your shoes today, like you're awesome. Like, no, that's nothing big deal, like don't patronize me. A genuine affirmation can, you know, acknowledge something you've observed and actually build rapport because it shows that you care. Sometimes when we're making a change, we have setbacks, we have failures, we have unsuccessful attempts. So affirmations of past successes, affirmations of our attempts and our efforts here that are genuine and congruent here can actually build rapport and help us feel better that's possible, even though we've had some setbacks. Reflective listening as a technique or as a tool here. Very much the idea of understanding what we've heard by reflecting back there. So, hey, I hear what you're saying, man. What I'm hearing you say is the following. Some complex ones, so you're going to add some information to our reflections here with a more complex one. So what I'm hearing you saying, and that reflects back to your values of. So it's important to you, what I've heard you say is it's important to be the best parent you can be, and so by doing that, you are, you know, not using pot as often as you were before. With our summaries, again, showing that we're listening here, we're going to summarize what we've heard. It's important to summarize to make sure that we've heard things correctly, as opposed to simply going forth what we thought we heard. We want to make sure we're going to check back in. And again, if we've misheard things, it's an opportunity to clarify, to redo things, to make sure that we're on the right track. Now, the cool thing about providing summaries is you can strategically, as a worker here, include or exclude information you want to emphasize or focus on. So if you're talking about all the good things about, if you're talking about the change behavior of using alcohol or not using alcohol, some of the good things that they, you know, talking about why they may want to stay where they are because they like the feeling of being drunk. You can leave that part of the summary when, you know, talking about the pros and cons of making the change behavior. You get to pick what you're going to focus on with a summary. So that's kind of one of the things you have available to you. All right, I'm going to pause and check back for any questions from you guys. Any questions? Pacing okay for you guys? We've got about a half hour, a little bit more to go here. Let's scroll through my question list again. You hear my clicking on my slides here. Okay so far. All right. I see Caitlin's tweeting massively about my examples here. Wonderful, Caitlin. Thank you so much for that. All right. So evoking change talk. So when we're going through the evoking process here of how we're going to actually draw forth change talk, what does that actually look like for us? So I've got 10 examples or 10 points to make here. Asking evocative questions. So open questions, and again, the answer is going to change or be some change talk here. The idea of decisional balance. So the pros and cons of both changing the behavior and also staying the same. So again, we really want to emphasize and make sure that we are looking and exploring both sides of that and not simply focusing on what's important to us or why we think the change should be made here. We really want to draw forth the idea of why it's good or bad to stay where they are, as well as the change there. If you don't like the idea of pros and cons, you can talk about good things and not so good things. So what's the best thing about getting high? What's the worst thing about getting high? What's the best thing about having your own place? What's the worst thing about having your own place? Again, getting a sense of good things and not so good things. Elaborations. Tell me more about that. My go-to question, I used to be an intake worker doing, frontline intakes and screenings. My go-to question whenever I was stuck was, tell me more about that. I really want to hear your story. Tell me more about, and whatever it was we're talking about, tell me more about that. So again, the idea of trying to, understand how a change would be possible by telling me more about the current behavior or the desired change going forward here. So we can also look back. So can you think about a time, before you started drinking alcohol, how was life for you back then? Tell me more about that. How are things better? How are things worse? Not looking at the root cause necessarily, but just trying to look back and say, you've had a period of life where you weren't engaged in this behavior. How are things back then? Hey, if things happen or if things continue happening as they are, looking forward here, what may happen? What's going to, will anything change for you? Will anything be the same for you? And then motivational interviewing, and this was as a trainee when I was going through this the first time, I kind of laughed at the idea of the miracle question. It seemed ridiculous to me until I actually tried it in my practice, and then it was like, hey, this actually works. If you've not heard of the idea of the miracle question before, here it is for you. And I do encourage you to try it at least once in your practice. So when talking through a change and looking at, yes, it's difficult to make this change, but then you say, okay, Joe, if a miracle happened overnight, so if you went to bed tonight and a miracle happened while you were sleeping, and in the morning you woke up and the change had taken place. So in the morning you woke up and you're no longer drinking alcohol. In the morning you woke up and you had your own place and you were housed, and it was, tell me what would that be like for you? What would be different? What would be the same? What would be different from how it is for you today? So if we snapped our fingers and a miracle occurred, how would things be different tomorrow than they are today? And again, trying to get, okay, now we understand the differences. How do we get there from here? We can go to the extremes. What are the worst things that can happen if you continue this behavior? What are the best things that can happen if you make the change? These are readiness rulers, again, assessing confidence, importance, and readiness. If we're stuck, we can always go back to exploring values and goals. So how does this fit into your guiding principles, your guiding values? Does it help you realize those goals? Does it get in the way of it? Is this irrelevant to it? And again, we can look back at past successes and what people have done in the past to be successful in making a change as a way of looking for that and how we can apply that in our work. All right. Now, some things to be aware of here. We want to get away from the idea of the writing reflex and discord. And what are those things, Jeff? Well, I'm glad you thought of the question. Here's what the writing reflex is all about. So we sometimes get in the trap or the pattern of wanting to fix things. Because again, we're helpful people. We didn't get into the field because we're okay with the status quo. We want to help and fix and make better. And that's great to some degree. But if the client actually asks for help, we can actually do more harm than good. So if we swoop in like a superhero with our cape on and try to make a change and fix things without permission to do so, we disempower people and we get in the way of actually making a change, and we lose rapport and we lose that relationship. So when that happens, we will sometimes come across discord or don't change talk. When suddenly we come in with a solution and the magic answer that we weren't asked for, people will put their backs up and push us away when that happens. Sometimes we take a side. We want to argue for a change. We see the benefit of making the change, and therefore we're gonna be the advocate for that change, as opposed to being in an MI context here the neutral third party who's simply looking at and talking about values and beliefs and change and discord or discrepancy. We're going to take a side. We want to avoid taking a side here. We want to, again, not try to persuade people to make a change. Again, so it's going to push them towards sticking their heels in. We don't want to start planning and taking actions before there's readiness to take the action. We really want to, again, avoid the idea of pushing people before they're ready for it. If we disagree, if we were going to argue, again, we're going to push people away. We want to avoid the idea of disagreeing. Sorry, I'll just flip kind of quickly for me there. Finally, the idea of the expert trap with the writing reflex. if we come from a place of offering ideas and advice and solutions that we weren't asked for, we come from a place of, I know better than you know about your own life. And we really want to try to avoid that. So we don't want to become the expert on their lives when we're not, which also can manifest itself by suggesting changes and get into the idea of focusing too soon before you better understand the situation. So if you start focusing before you've truly engaged and built that rapport, you may miss some things as to why the behavior is taking place in the first place. If you ask more questions and understood them better, you wouldn't be where you are with focusing too soon. I kind of alluded to earlier the idea of the question answer trap. We're just kind of stuck back and forth and not really making progress because we're stuck in the yes and no questions. And so we really want to avoid that whenever possible. Sometimes we can label behaviors. I don't think I need to elaborate on that one. We've all come across that in our practice in our personal lives. So moving on to Discord. Now, Discord is the idea where things seem off. If you can picture in your mind like two cogs in a machine or gears in a machine, and they're not quite aligned, they're kind of slipping, and there's like you can feel or sense or hear the idea of things as being off. And if you've ever had a relationship in your life with a friend, with a colleague, with a human being, so if you're human on the call, you've all had this experience where things just seem off. And it's not always easy to put your finger on what's off, but you can sense there's an offness to it, and that's Discord. Now, if we focus on the MI skills again, we're slipping here. Obviously, we're at a spot where things aren't making sense here. Let's go back. Let's re-engage here. Let's focus some more here. Let's evoke some more before they're planning here. If we can do those things and draw forth our MI practice here, we can decrease the Discord. Okay, we weren't able to plan. Hey, we got there too soon. That was my bad. You weren't ready to plan, you weren't quite there with your rulers here. Let's go back and talk about how we can get you from like a 3 to a 4. Let's talk about why this goal is not important to you. What might be a better goal for you to work on here? So it's acknowledging that this Discord has occurred, and we're trying to address that and move forward from there. We can also increase Discord by, again, digging our heels in as a practitioner with our writing reflexes. So becoming the expert, moralizing, preaching about why it's important, we're going to push people away and increase the Discord. So it's really important when you sense that things are off to step back and say, hey, wait a second here. Things are off. We moved too fast. I wasn't listening to you well enough here. I assumed things I shouldn't have assumed. Let's go back and make some progress here. Let's figure out where we slipped and move forward in a new direction. Now, sometimes, depending on the situation, you may have people dig their heels in and say, I'm not ready to deal with this now. You pushed me too far away. You say, okay, that happened. Let's change direction. Let's have a different conversation about change, or let's come back this at a different time when we're both, cooled off, and we can do this, with level heads going forward. So Discord can manifest itself either as withdrawal behaviors or escalating behaviors. Now, if you're having clients withdrawing, you may see things like disengagement or inattention or disliking activities or being more passive or avoiding situations or leaving. So if you have clients who disengage all the time, who don't show up for their appointments, or who no-show you when you go to their home visits, it's a sign of Discord. If you're talking about making a change and suddenly they're avoiding you, there's some Discord. With the escalation, on the flip side of the withdrawal, you're going to have some arguing, some oppositional language coming up here, some defensiveness, some denying, some judging language coming back at you because you've pushed and increased the Discord. So again, if you hear those sorts of things, it's a sign Discord is happening. And again, when that happens, you want to step back, reassess where we are, and figure out how to move forward. So with Discord, you can do some reflections, and again, kind of back to our reflective statements here with our ORs. So again, your simple reflections. What I'm hearing you saying is that you're not ready to make a change, stop drinking because, and whatever the reason you've heard, you can reflect back to them. Again, with the meaning and context here with complex reflections. So what I've heard you say is you want to continue drinking because that's how you're coping with the stress you've had, dealing with your boss at work. And so that's why the change is not really being looked at right now. Is that what I'm hearing? So again, reflecting back and making sure we're understanding why the Discord has occurred. Now, there's a technique we call double-sided reflections. So you can get the Discord statement where you can reflect back with the other side. So what I'm hearing you say is, drinking is important to you because it's helping you cope with your stressful boss. But what you said earlier is that you want to find a different job and a different way of coping with your stresses. So you're just kind of unsure if drinking is still good for you or if you are ready for a change. So again, you can talk about the ambivalence with your double reflection. So you're drawing back on what you've already, again, evoked and what you've heard as far as why the change wasn't being considered in the first place. Now again, dancing with Discord, or what we used to call rolling with resistance in MI practice. When Discord pops up, you can shift away. Like, we're stuck right now. We're not going to make any progress on this goal, so let's shift focus to something else right now. We'll come back to this, talking about your landlord relationship, or you're dealing with your neighbors, next visit. Like, now we're both dug in. We're not going to make any progress. We're just going to get further aggravated here. Let's just shift away right now. We can reframe. So again, we want to validate the person that has perspective and has, things have gone on here, but we also want to provide some new meaning if we can here. And emphasizing that we're not going to, overpower or take control of the relationship here. We're going to let them know that they're in control. The change we're talking about is the change they're wanting to make. They can decide if and when they're ready for it, and they can let us know when they want to talk about it again. They're in control of that. They are the boss of themselves, as it were. Now, the idea of ambivalence, again, that fence-sitting perspective, the uncertainty to making a change. And we've all gone through ambivalence. If not today, then at least at some point in the last week, we've had some feelings of ambivalence in our lives. So we want to normalize it, call it what it is. Sometimes we're actually going to invite that. So again, we can make sure that if we're going to invite ambivalence, well, it's not going to pop up later because we've already dealt with it earlier on in the change talk process. It's really important to acknowledge that. Now, normalizing ambivalence is the idea of saying things like, hey, change is hard. Again, we're going to acknowledge it. We all have difficulties making changes at times. There are two sides to every coin. So yes, I understand it's important to stop drinking. Also recognize how drinking has helped you get to the point where you are right now, and you know what to expect when you drink every day. So I get that. Here's a statement you guys may not have heard before. I kind of like this one. Choosing to not take an action is still a choice. So if you don't want to take an action at all, you're still choosing to do something by doing nothing. That's still a choice you are in control of. When we invite ambivalence, again, talking about the behavior they're trying to change, what do you enjoy most about drinking? What do you enjoy most about living outside? What's the best thing about being in a shelter? Now, again, you may not have asked that question yourself, but again, you're going to get some interesting responses as far as how you're going to have a conversation of change going forward here. What's the best thing about living outside? What's the best thing about not having a job? What's the best thing about not having, any responsibilities? What's the best thing about, on the flip side, what concerns you about staying outside? What are your thoughts? What are your worries about not having a job? What are your worries about not having a place to stay? What are your worries about drinking, until you're drunk every day? What will you miss about living outside? What will you miss about being in the shelter? What will you miss about, arguing with your neighbors? What will make it hard to change? What's the biggest barrier you're going to come across? What are you concerned about facing as you make this change in your life? What's the biggest challenge you're going to come across? And again, once you hear those things, you're not going to say, oh, well, here's the answer for you. It's okay. So your biggest challenge will be this. What's your plan for dealing with that? What are your thoughts on that? How could you overcome that? You're going to miss the social aspect of drinking because you drink with your friends and hang out with your buddies, and so you really enjoy socializing with your friends while you're drinking. If you stop drinking, how will you fill that void? How will you meet people, or would you meet people who don't drink? And where might you do that? So again, trying to get the idea of the positive drawing forth of what's going on here. when acknowledging ambivalence here, again, the idea is to recognize it happens. So on the one hand, you drink with your friends and it's relaxing and socializing. On the other hand, your body's getting kind of, some impacts on your health and your budget's kind of shot from it. So again, looking at both sides and playing devil's advocate and really pointing out both sides there. You feel both relieved and concerned at the same time. And the idea of acknowledging ambivalence and calling it what it is. All right, so once we've done the engaging process, we've drawn forth values and goals and beliefs, we've engaged, we've built that relationship and that rapport. We've then focused on specific change behavior, specific change goal. We've evoked ideas, we've gone through our readiness rulers here, we've talked about the importance and confidence and readiness here. We've dealt with the ambivalence and discord. It's now time to make a plan. And so this is the last step, is the actual making of a plan. And so the whole purpose behind MI is to actually have a decision to make a change and jot that down and make a tangible plan to move forward here. So it's time to do this when we see some of the following things popping up in our conversation. So there's a shift from talking about the problem in the past to the future and the change. So no longer is it about, well, I'm getting too old to drink as much as I am, to, when I stop drinking, I'm going to start doing these things instead. So there's a tangible shift of looking forward now as opposed to looking back. You may hear questions about the change process. So I've never gone to treatment before. Tell me more about that, Jeff. What's treatment all about? What can I expect from that? Or I've never had to worry about a budget before. Tell me more about this budgeting thing you talk about. What's that look like for me? So you're going to have questions about the actual process of making a change. Might be some actual envisioning of the future. So seeing themselves in that new role, in that new light. Once a change has been made, you can talk about how that will look. Once the commitment to making a change has happened, there's going to be some resolve showing up there. We're committed to it, we're making it happen, we're going to stick with it, it's now my choice, I'm now in control of it, I'm excited about this. And there may be actual tangible shifting of their demeanor. And again, if you think of an important change you made in your life, there's a process of the stress behind it, there's the thinking about the weighing of pros and cons and options, and once you decided, even before the change occurs, there's a sense of, I decided. Now, what happens next is unknown, perhaps. There's going to be some difficulties with the transition process here, but for this moment in time, for this, I've decided, I've made a decision here. There's a sense of, I did it. We've picked a direction, we're going to go there now. Yes, there's going to be some things along the way to plan for and deal with, but for right now, I'm at peace, I'm calm, I feel good, because I've made a choice. So you may actually see a tangible shift in their demeanor, body language, physical language. You may see all kinds of things. Trying out steps. And some commitment talk about, I'm going to do this, and here's why I'm going to do it, and here's what's important to me. And again, you want to re-emphasize and again, focus on tying that back to the values and the goals they've already talked to you about. Now, before you begin the planning process here, it's really important to make sure there's enough engagement. So again, anything we may have missed along the way, you talked about your values before, any values we may have missed as to why that's important to you, anything that may be more important to you that we already haven't covered. Because, and I'll share a silly example for you about this. I could stand to lose about 10 pounds. I'm not really overweight. I've had some travel belly on me. I'm getting older in age here. I could lose about 10 pounds, but I also really love bacon. So to me, the idea of losing 10 pounds means eating healthier, making better decisions, at restaurants, at the grocery store. But I have to ask myself, is my love of bacon more important than my desire to lose 10 pounds? So it's also important when you're doing change talk with somebody to make sure there's no other competing values and goals they have that you haven't talked about yet that may get in the way of the goal they're trying to work towards. Once you've done that, make sure there's a clear shared goal and enough motivation, and we can assess that through the readiness rulers whether there's enough motivation for the change. So again, if there's a scoring of 3s and 4s before you make a plan, it's probably going to fall apart. You want to make sure that we're making a plan, we're at least like 8s and 9s as far as the confidence importance and readiness because we're actually going to have some success in making the plan going forward. You know, if you're down to the 7s and 6s, that's okay. You may have some difficulty in planning and success, but if you're stuck at 1s and 2s, it's a recipe for disaster. So again, making sure and checking back into the rulers to see if we're in fact ready to make the change. Now, our role when we talk about planning here is to do 2 things. The first is to, again, strengthen the change, talk, and commitment. And the second is to actually develop the plan. And again, the development of the plan is not us directing, it's us facilitating. If you think we're here, if you're having a conversation and you think that we're ready for this, we need to do a couple of things. And this is my last couple slides here. We're getting towards the end. Introducing, summarizing, and asking key questions. And the first step of introduction here, it really is a simple, hey, we're going to summarize what we've talked about. And really, that, I mean, I think what like the college essay, your summary paragraph, you're going to say before that, here's my summary paragraph. That's essentially what we're doing here, is saying we're going to summarize what we've talked about. We're going to summarize all our conversation here. Here is the important goals you talked about. Here's the values you talked about. Here's why the change is important to you. Here's the specific change you talked about. You felt this important level, this confidence, this level of readiness for it here. You were like a 6, a 7, and a 9. You moved beyond that, and now we're here. So we're going to summarize. Once it's summarized, we're going to summarize the ambivalence. You talked about these things. We're going to highlight the change behavior, the change talk, no change talk. So again, going through our summaries, here's what we've covered here. And our last step is our key questions. So where to from here? What's the next step? You've got a plan in place here. What's the first step you want to work on your plan? So where to from here? So again, when we're doing the planning here, we're jotting down the plan. We need to figure out what's the next step's going to be. What changes, if any, are you thinking about making specifically? What goals are there? So again, the more specific the goal can be, the better, the easier it's going to be for you here. Now, I mentioned earlier my example many slides back about finding a job. So specific goal, I'm going to send out 5 resumes per week. Broad goal, I'll find the perfect job. So again, the more specific you can be, the better it's going to be as far as making a change because it's tangible, it's measurable, it's achievable. You think about smart goal setting here. It's specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timed, as opposed to a very broad, I'm going to conquer the world. I'm going to, find the perfect job. I'm going to make it more specific. So that's what I'm trying to emphasize here before we wrap up here. And then to really reinforce that it's their plan and not your plan being imposed, what do you see as your options? Like, yes, I could walk you through, I could tell you all the things you should do because I'm, a social work type person here and I know all the answers. I'm being facetious when I say that. But what do you see as your options? What are the steps you should take for you? What again, it may be something I haven't thought of before. It might be a very creative step that I would never have come up with on my own here. So and it's your plan. So what's important to you? What do you see as your options going forward from here? And our final key question here is ask for commitment to the plan. So now that you've come up with a plan, where do you stand with it? And again, you can go back to your readiness rulers. Okay, you've got a plan. We've written it down here. How important is this plan to you on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not very important, with 10 being very important? How important is this plan to you? How confident do you feel in following through on this plan? How ready are you to make this plan a part of your life? So again, go through your readiness rulers again to assess to see where we are. All right, with that final summary there, I'm out of content for you guys. It's 10 minutes to the hour, so we're a little ahead of schedule here. Any questions from you guys? I'm just going to go through my question box again one more time, see if I missed anything from you guys. But any questions to cover, please let me know before we finish for the day. All right, there was one that popped up earlier. I'm not sure because my questions are alphabetical as opposed to sequential, so I may have missed this earlier on. So So Catherine asked, so what about the clients who, there we go. What about clients who want to change but don't know how to change? So for example, I'm depressed, but I don't know how to fix it. So again, talking about those key questions and evoking questions earlier on, Catherine, about the idea of, was there a time in your life before you were depressed? And tell me more about that. What was life like for you back then? What are the things you've tried in the past to not feel the way you're feeling right now? Have you thought about other options for you there as a way of going through that? Hopefully that, I know I'm a little behind. My questions didn't pop up how I was hoping, unfortunately. Anything else from you guys? You've been a wonderful, quiet, good questions audience for me here. I really appreciate that. I think those asking about how to access the slides and the recording, my understanding is the Texas Homeless Network has all of your contact information from your registrations. They'll send it to you guys or a link to it once we're wrapped up today.
Yep.
I don't have an answer as to when it's going to come, but Craig will jump in right now.
Yeah, once I get the recording set up and gone to YouTube, I'll get your materials, I'll draft up an email, and I will send it to everybody that was registered, so especially those that had some screen issues today. You can watch the recording at your own leisure. We will send out the slides as soon as I get those as well. But any other questions, y'all can send directly to me, and we can get those to Jeff. This is a reminder, we do have another webinar with Jeff on 7/24, and that one's going to be trauma-informed care, so I'll send that link out as well with all the materials from today.
All right. If nothing else from you guys, thank you for your Friday afternoon. I really appreciate it. I'm assuming it's very hot in Texas wherever you guys are, so enjoy the heat. It's hot where I'm up in Canada right now, so I'll enjoy the heat as well. Gotta love that. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Y'all have a good weekend, and we'll see y'all soon.